Good afternoon. Welcome to a tasting of the fall releases here at Hafner Vineyard. I'm Scott Hafner, and we're delighted to have you joining us today. We're expecting about 134 patrons and guests on the call this afternoon, and we're going to wait just a few minutes for a few people to catch up. In the meantime, let me cover a few details. We are tickled that we have friends from far and near on the call today, including a number of patrons from the East Coast, and also happy to be under the watchful eye of our two sisters, Julie and Betsy, fellow partners in this family business enterprise. Before we begin, I just want to suggest that you open the wines that we're going to be tasting today. Some of you have 6 wines. We'll be tasting the 2018 Chardonnay, 2017 and 2016 Chardonnay, as well as the 2016 Next Red and 2015 and 2014 Next Red. If opening 6 bottles of wines is too adventuresome, even for a Friday afternoon, we'd suggest that you limit yourself to just the 2 main releases, the 2018 Chardonnay and the 2016 Next Red. Just a couple of reminders. You are muted, and unfortunately, we don't have the pleasure of seeing you. What that means is that you can get up and move around and talk, and you don't have to worry that you'll be interrupting our program. We hope that the internet is cooperative this afternoon and we don't have any connectivity issues, which is always a possibility out here in the country. Hafner patrons are curious and inquisitive lot, and we love that. So on your Zoom screen, we ask you to use the Q&A feature to ask us questions as we go along, and we'll look forward to answering those a little bit later. Most of you who are joining us this afternoon are members of the annual tasting program. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate deeply the trust that you place in us by saying, yeah, send me 2 bottles of every vintage you make. We are deeply honored by that trust. It also means that you're probably the first kids on the block with any new release. And that's definitely the case with the 2018 Chardonnay and 2016 Next Red. Tasting packages go out to annual tasting program members first. Another perk of the program is having the opportunity to order previous vintages to compare with each new release. That mimics what we do here. Every time we release a new vintage, we try that vintage against several previous releases. When it's the Chardonnays, it's 3, 4, 5 vintages. When it's the Cabernets, it could be 10 or 12. I know, tough work, someone's got to do it. And we love that you have that opportunity to add previous vintages to your tasting package orders, and patrons tell us all the time that they enjoy that. It's what allows us to do this tasting today. I don't want to say that there's a silver lining to COVID, because Lord knows this pandemic is so challenging for all of us. But one of the things that's been interesting is it's challenged us to find new ways to communicate and be with people. We never would have thought a year ago that here on this Friday afternoon, evening if you're on the East Coast, we would be tasting new releases with you. This is a treat for us. It's a delight, and we are grateful to find new ways to be with you and to be in your living room with you, even if it's just with a technological link. Let me give you an outline of the program this afternoon in just a moment. I'll happily turn this over to Parke and Sarah, who will take you through the tasting. And these are the wines, as I mentioned, that we'll taste. And this is the sequence that we'll taste them in, left to right. After they've tasted these wines with you, Kate, who's the master of all things Zoom here at Hafner Vineyard, will join us for some question and answers. And the entire time should last about 60 minutes. But we hope that your enjoyment of these wines does not stop when your screen goes dark, but instead that this is the beginning of an enjoyable evening, perhaps with a couple of friends. We always enjoy telling you what we find in the wines, and I know that you're interested in what Parke and Sarah are gonna find in the wines. But we are especially interested in what you think. Everybody's opinion is subjective. And so as you taste the wines, let me invite you to make a couple of notes about how you find the Chardonnays or the next reds, how you might describe them in a word or two. And we'll be particularly interested and ask you for your thoughts a bit later. Finally, many hands are responsible and contribute to the wine that is in the glass that you're holding right now. And we love every opportunity to and give you a sense of all the good people who are involved in this effort of growing grapes, making wine, and marketing wine and getting it to you. Here we are in November of last year. You can tell it's pre-COVID because we're all sitting close together and not masked as we all are these days. What you see is 4 generations of Hafners spanning from Marie, Kate and Martin's daughter, all the way up to our father, Dick, who will celebrate his 95th birthday later this year. Those 4 generations of Hafners are also paralleled by 2 or 3 generations of families that we have the privilege of working with that are in this photograph. Them, their parents, and in some cases, their grandparents. It's really, it's been an absolute blessing that we've had this team for so many years. Without further ado, I'm gonna exit stage right, and Parke and Sarah are gonna seize the camera and take you through the tasting of the Chardonnays and next red. And I'll be back later. Thank you.
Well, we're going to start with the Chardonnay, and here are some fun facts so that we don't have to memorize them. Chardonnay is obviously one of the most commonly planted white grapes, or the most widely planted white grape around the world, and people know it from Burgundy in France. Also, it's used to make champagne or sparkling wine here in the United States, champagne in France. There are over 500,000 acres planted around the world, and on our property, we have about 33 acres of Chardonnay planted. It is our only white variety that we grow. And here are the two blocks that we draw from for our main Chardonnay. The one on the right-hand side is referred to as the house block near the vineyard manager's home. That is clone 15. And then the other one that is circled in the lower left-hand corner is known as the North 1 block, and that's clone 4. The other main Chardonnay clone that we grow on the property is Dijon clone 76, which is used mainly for the reserve Chardonnay, but a little bit goes into the main Chardonnay as well. So here is a photograph of the vineyard team, all of whom are full-time employees. That's done intentionally to be able to provide our staff with the benefits that we have ourselves, and we want them to have in the vineyard as well: full-time employment, paid holidays, paid vacation, 401k, medical insurance, all of those sorts of things. Normally we harvest the Chardonnay around between about 22.5 bricks to 23.5 bricks. Bricks is the measurement, the units we use to measure sugar. This year, the average sugar was just over 22.5, just a reflection on the year. Our decision as to when to pick is based mainly on flavor. As many of you learned if you were here at one of our previous Zoom tastings. We also look very carefully at the weather this time of year. And those are the two main things that, and sugar, of course, we track the sugar in the grapes as well. The grapes are always harvested at night when they're as cool as possible, which is why the machine you see in the photograph on the right-hand side is illuminated by lights. Let's see. So in the cellar, the team usually consists at the winery of myself and my lovely co-winemaker, Sarah. Ricardo, our assistant winemaker, a French intern, which we did not have because of the pandemic. And in the photograph on the left, you see Arthur Rubière, who was here 2 years ago. And in the middle is Jose Luis, who is one of the vineyard team members, but he is always the one that brings the fruit, the tractor laden with fruit back here to the winery. It comes to the winery in a gondola, which is basically a stainless steel box on wheels, and you see one there in the left-hand picture elevated so that it can then empty into our fruit sorter, which is where we separate any stems or leaves that might be harvested with the fruit. The juices then the juice and the skins then go into the press, which is where we separate the juice from the skins. And then the juice is settled overnight, and the next morning we pump or rack the clear juice off of the sediment. And to make the main Chardonnay, we utilize a combination of French and California winemaking techniques, which reflect both my educational experience at UC Davis, getting a degree in winemaking, and then working 2 years in Napa Valley. And then Sarah and I got married, and we went to France for a working honeymoon. And so our winemaking style is based on those experiences, and it's a blend of French and California winemaking techniques. So about half of the main Chardonnay is fermented in barrels in the French tradition. The other half is fermented in stainless steel tanks, which is the California tradition. At the end of alcoholic fermentation, about 40%, or in this case, 42% of those barrels undergo malolactic fermentation, which is a second fermentation that converts the grape's natural malic acid to the softer lactic acid. The second fermentation is a compound called diacetyl, which is the compound that gives butter its distinctive flavor. So often you get a buttery or sort of a butterscotch type character from that second fermentation, which is most pronounced right at the end of malolactic fermentation, say in October, November. But with extended barrel aging, such as we do, we find it just adds a creaminess to the wine that we find very appealing. So that wine is then aged for a total of about 10 months, 6 months of which would be in barrels, before it is bottled in July of the following year, and then bottled aged for about 14 months until it's released in September, 2 years after the grapes were picked. So the three wines that we're tasting today, just to remind you, you probably have them in front of you, are the 2018 Maine Chardonnay, which is our current release that just hit the streets a couple weeks ago or last week, and then the 17 and the 16 as comparison. And I'm going to turn the tasting part over to Sarah, since she has arguably the keener palate in the organization. So here we go.
Well, I hope you've been enjoying the wines as Parke's been telling you how we make the wines. But for me, the 18 is a really perfect example of how our wines are when they're released. It's really young and fruit forward. It has really nice bright fruit aromas. I think of them as sweet pears and white peaches that are really ripe right off the vine or from the farmer's market. And in the mouth, it's really soft and supple. That's that malolactic and extended barrel aging that allows that to happen. And then there's a nice floral note in the end with a little toasted brioche and nice vanilla flavors.
Yes, one thing we wanted to mention as we're going through these wines, so let's just remind you that, as Scott mentioned earlier, we'd love to have you come up with a couple descriptors that you feel are fairly consistent throughout our Chardonnay program over the years. What sort of descriptors would you say describe our Chardonnay? And later on, Kate's going to gather those up. We'll hope that people will send those in. She'll gather those up and put them in a word cloud. And if you don't know what that means, ask your kids or grandchildren, as I did. And Kate will send it to you later this week, next week.
We're a little technically challenged, what can we say? So on to the 17. You can see the transition from a young, bright fruit wine to the 17, and it still has some lovely fruit aromas of like limes and honeydew melons and a little peach as well. But it's rounder, softer, creamier, and it's just beginning to develop what we call bottle bouquet. When I came to this business, I went to UC Davis, but I studied English and history. So I came to this business not from the scientific point of view. And the thing that was interesting is when Parke talked about bottle bouquet, I was like, oh yeah, right. But it really does change in the bottle because the cork allows the wine to develop and age. You see these lovely oak tanks behind us. We use those for aging. Our stainless steel tanks are what we ferment in, but then the rest of the year, they're empty. So if we put it in the stainless steel tank, the wine would not develop because wine evaporates through the pores of the wood. And every 2 weeks, we go through and we open all the cooperage up and we fill it back up. That's what allows the wine to develop and age. So you're beginning to see a little bit of that lovely development through the bottle aging. in the 2017. The 2016, I think, is absolutely lovely now. A lot of people think that, oh, slight adjustment, thank you. A lot of people think that a 4-year-old Chardonnay is way too old. And that may be for your palate, but for my palate, I adore this vintage. I think it's absolutely perfect right now because you get some delicate fruit, lemons and Comus pears and a little Chardonnay melon, but it's so round and supple on the palate, and it has that, what I describe as a flinty flavor, 2 rocks hitting each other. And it's just lovely. It's the wine that we are drinking at home with Park staff, Dick, on most nights, because he likes to have a glass of Chardonnay before dinner begins. So,
I'd just say that when we're doing vertical tastings and we have 3 consecutive vintages of Chardonnay, we do notice some significant differences from year to year. And I say that because with the red wines, the differences between consecutive years is much less. That's because the lifespan of a white wine tends to be much shorter than a red wine. So it's accelerating through its life and more quickly than a red wine like Cabernet, or in our case today, the next red. So although we have 3 vintages, although the 3 vintages of Chardonnay, we notice fairly decent differences, I wouldn't be disappointed if people didn't find huge differences between the consecutive vintages of next red. So often when we're selling verticals at Christmas, there's a bigger spread between the wines. Perhaps this is the time to move on to the next red. Oh, before we do that, one of the questions that we often get is, what's the difference between the Maine and the Reserve Chardonnay? And as I mentioned, the Maine Chardonnay is kind of a blend of French and California winemaking techniques that I observed earlier in my career. The Reserve Chardonnay, however, is inspired by my time working in the town of, which is worked in a very small traditional winery. So it was a big change from working in Napa Valley. So just to remind you, in the case of the Maine Chardonnay, as we were talking about, half of it's fermented in stainless steel tank, and the other half is fermented in barrels. Whereas for the Reserve Chardonnay, 100% of the juice is barrel fermented. At the end of alcoholic fermentation, in the case of the Maine Chardonnay, about 40% goes from malolactic fermentation. For the Reserve Chardonnay, 100% goes from malolactic fermentation. And in both cases, those wines are aged sur lie, which means with the sediment, which is mainly the yeast after they die from running out of sugar to ferment. The Maine Chardonnay is aged for about 6 months in barrels. The Reserve Chardonnay is aged for about 17 months in barrels. And in both cases, we're looking for a similar oak component. My feeling is oak should add some interest, some complexity, some nuances to the wine, but should not come through as oak in the wine. And as such, we have a very light touch when it comes to oak in our wine. So for the Maine Chardonnay, about 20% is new oak because it's aged for a much shorter period of time in barrels. The Reserve Chardonnay, we use about 10% new oak barrels for that wine. The Maine Chardonnay is bottled about 10 months after harvest. The Reserve Chardonnay about 17, 18 months after harvest. And then both of them receive about 14 months in the bottle before they're released. And then some of the descriptors that we use to describe the 2 different wines, the Maine Chardonnay tends to be a little brighter, a little more lively, has a little more fruit character because of the cooler fermentation temperature that goes on in tanks, as opposed to the reserve Chardonnay being all barrel fermented. You don't have as much of that fruity character, but that is replaced by more flinty, complex, and rounder, softer flavors. So that's just a quick snapshot of the difference between the two styles that we make. The most convincing way to learn about the difference in styles is to try the two side by side from the same vintage, and then you can kind of see how the winemaking techniques impact the flavor profile of those two wines. Moving on to the next red. Our next red is and prior to that time, we'd only been making our Cabernet, but we had planted some Malbec and Petit Verdot to blend with the Cabernet. And then we thought it might be fun to make a Malbec-based wine. And we decided to call it Next Red so that we were not limited by a 75% minimum requirement of having Malbec in the bottle.
On the label.
Yeah, so that's
Government.
If it says Malbec, then at least 75% of the wine in that bottle must be Malbec. We didn't want to limit ourselves to that because we felt that we could improve the wine by blending in a not insignificant amount of Cabernet, and in some cases, some Petit Verdot as well, which is the other two red grapes that we grow. So Malbec really originated in the Cahors region in France, but most people know it from Argentina, particularly Mendoza, which has the most acres planted of Malbec in the world. We have about 7 acres of Malbec currently producing. We have another 4 acres coming on next year. And you can see that Kate has circled the 2 blocks where we have Malbec that are currently producing. We also use some Malbec to produce our rosé wine, so rosé of Malbec. So in the vineyard, it's, let's see, another photograph of the vineyard team, and there's a photograph of some Malbec grapes waiting to be harvested. The Malbec is the largest berried variety that we grow. It's very juicy. We love eating it. The deer love eating it. Fortunately, this year, the deer have been elsewhere, and we have a little bit more Malbec, or had a little Malbec to harvest, but we picked it all 2 days ago. The clones that we use for our program are mainly 595 and 598. And usually we pick it around 23 to 24 bricks. This year it was, what was it? 23 and a half. So since the berries, as I mentioned, are and most of the flavor and color is contained in the skins, if we can increase the skin to juice ratio, we can make a more intensely flavored wine. Cabernet berries are very small. Petit Verdot berries are even smaller. But one of the things we do to intensify the flavor in the Malbec is that we bleed, or saigne, which is the French term, some of the juice away. So when the grapes arrive back at the winery in the gondola, the first thing we do is we draw some of the juice away from the grapes immediately, and that goes into our rosé program. Then the rest of the remaining juice in the skins are pumped into tanks for fermentation. We've had some questions about what, from one of our previous Zoom presentations, there was a question or a couple of questions about what it's like to drive the harvester. Actually, I couldn't tell you firsthand because But I've never been on the wheel except when it's been parked. But David harvests our vineyards almost exclusively. And here's a quick clip, little film that we put together of what it's like. Some of this was even filmed this morning as we picked the Petit Verdot. But the machine harvester is in essence a large tractor that straddles a row of grapevines. It's over the row of grapevines, and it has these flexible rods underneath that are called impellers or bow rods, and they impact the canopy and knock the individual berries off. So it's very important that you drive carefully down, staying centered over the row, but he has great view. And then at the end of the row, what we do is we then empty these tanks that are on board the machine harvester into our gondolas. This is one of the two gondolas you see there. And then from there, the fruit is driven immediately back to the winery, where it goes through the fruit sorter and is processed and ready for fermentation. So next we're going to taste the wine shortly, but just a couple of
But
scenes.
go ahead and start tasting.
Yeah. Here are a couple of scenes from the winemaking side of the operation. To make a red wine, you ferment the juice with the skins because, as I mentioned, the color and flavor are in the skins. And we need the wine, the fermentation process to extract the color and flavor from the skins. So they're fermented together. The heat, the alcohol produced help to extract the color. And during fermentation, carbon dioxide gas is produced as a byproduct. As that gas floats up through the tank, it becomes trapped in the skins, causing the skins to float to the top of the tank, forming what's known as the cap. And we need to mix the cap in the fermenting juice, or we wouldn't get the extraction we're looking for. So we do what are called pump overs. We pull fermenting juice out of the bottom of the tank. And what you see in the middle photograph there is we're drawing juice out of the bottom of the tank, going through a screen into a drain tub, and then we're pumping it back over the skins in the tank to extract the color and flavor we're looking for. Do pump overs a day until the end of fermentation, which is usually 7 to 10, maybe 12 days later. And then we'll leave the wine in contact with the skins for an additional 2 weeks or so, which actually softens the tannins, softens the mouthfeel in the wine. So at that point, we'll then drain the wine out of the tanks, pull the skins out, which we are doing in the left-hand slide, and then we shovel the skins into the press to extract a little bit of remaining wine that's in the skins. We then settle that wine overnight, and the next day it's pumped into barrels where it undergoes malolactic fermentation and is also aged for about 22 months before it goes in the bottle. The slide on the photograph on the right-hand side, the guy in the gray hair, I don't know who that could be, but doing some analysis on juice samples, wine samples, which is something that has to be done with some regularity, just checking to make sure that nature is doing what we want it to do, and we've got the right bugs growing in the wine and not the wrong ones. So now we're gonna move on to tasting these three wines. Again, the 16, 15, and 14 next red. And if, as you're tasting them, you come up with a couple of words that you feel describe kind of the character that you might find all three of these wines, we'd love to have you send those to us so we can compile those and again put them in a word cloud, which you'll know all about if you ask Kate to send them to you. So I'm going to let Sarah describe these to you.
So Malbec for me, the descriptor, I have the actual grape is cola. You know, when you open a cold Coke on a hot day, you flip it open, that first burst of Coke, it smells just like Malbec. So I always describe it as cola spice, but also in the 2016, I get a nice blueberries, violets, and black cherries in the fruit aromas. To me, it's really fruity. And it's very lively on the palate. That's the Malbec. I describe Malbec as sort of, Parke may kill me, I think Malbec is the young, cool, hip guy. And and the Cabernet is a little more buttoned up, a little more refined, a little more elegant. He's the elegant older gentleman. So cool hip guy, Malbec.
Okay, whatever.
Little did you know.
We're having cab for dinner tonight.
On the palate, it's very soft on the palate. That's the Malbec, and it has I describe sort of Niçoise olives, sort of black olives, and a little dark bittersweet chocolate. And it's still pretty lively, pretty young. Oh, you're already on to the 15. Okay, so I also get the cola spice in this 2015, but it's beginning to develop some notes of interest. Carpaccio, juniper berries, a little blueberry, and if you taste it right next to the 2016, you can tell that it's a little bit softer, with notes of bittersweet chocolate and sort of roasted coffee. Especially in the finish, the nice roasted coffee. Again, for the 16, I get that lovely cola spice and a little fraise de bois, so a little bit more elegant, a little bit more refined, and some notes of Bresaola. So for me, Carpaccio is fresh and Bresaola is dried beef. And in the mouth, I get sort of Picholine olives instead of Niçoise, a little bit more elegant, a little more subtle, a little milk chocolate, India ink. I do a lot of drawing, so I taste the pen, so India ink, and some lovely vanilla aromas. So as Parke mentioned earlier, if you're tasting these at home and you have the 16, the 15, and the 14, the most interesting comparison, the easiest comparison is between the 16 and the 14, because there's an extra year development in the 14.
One of the questions we often get is, how do you decide on the blend for the next red, for the Cabernet? They're both intentional blends. The next red is not just whatever's left over from the Cabernet blend. It's an intentional blend each year. And let's see what Sarah thinks each variety contributes to the blend.
So as I said earlier, I think the Malbec is really fruit forward and supple and bright and lively, the whole cool hip guy. And then the Cabernet is a little bit more refined, but it has elegance. So if you had just Malbec, I don't think it would not last. So that's why we add a significant amount of Cabernet Sauvignon to the Malbec, to give it some presence.
Usually
to
10 to 20% Cabernet, in that range.
And Petit Verdot is an interesting variety. It's really dark and inky. We picked it today, and it turns your hands black pretty quickly. But it doesn't have a lot of varietal character. It's sort of chewy and complex, but I don't really have a fruit descriptor for it. And we usually, in both the Cabernet and the Next Red, we're just adding a little bit.
2 to 3, 4% at most, yeah.
So today we picked only 3.8 tons of Petit Verdot, and we're gonna, over all of our harvests, we're gonna have about
200 tons, yeah.
So it's just a little bit.
A little.
Okay, I'm gonna step off. Thank you for joining us, and Scott's gonna come and help with the question and answer.
So now you're experts on Chardonnay and Next Red. We hope that you've learned something this process and enjoyed it. So one of the things that we're curious about is having a sense of what you're enjoying right now. And I think Kate's gonna launch okay.
We want them to get the questions. We want to grill you first.
Okay, here's the mistress of all matters Zoom.
Hi, thanks for joining. And thanks for sending in some questions, both by the Q&A and beforehand. And don't forget that I'd love to do a word cloud of some of the descriptors of the Chardonnay. So what it reminds you of were, lemony, citrus, delicious, and then some of the Next Red. So feel free to use the chat to do that, or just email me and I'll add those to it. But we've had some great questions come in, and I wanted to get to a few of them along with some that we had beforehand, and we probably won't get to all of them. So my apologies, but we'll follow up with you next week. One of the ones that's come up has, you guys are an observant bunch, and notice that the 2018 Chardonnay has a new cork. So we wanted to have Dad or Scott answer about the new cork that we have.
Oh, good eyes. Whoever noticed that, well, probably many people noticed it. Anyway, we've been using natural cork since day one, and as with any natural product, there is some, and sometimes we would get a corked bottle, albeit not very often, fortunately. But we also noticed that, you see here that we often hold on to our wines a little bit longer than most people, and we want them to continue to age uniformly and well. And so after reading some studies about this new type of cork and talking to some of my colleagues, both here in California and in France, in fact, at the winery where I worked in Meursault, we decided we would demo a new kind of cork, it's also a natural product. They take the cork, they grind it up, they clean the particles, and then they adhere it back together in the shape of a cork. So not only is it guaranteed not to impart any corkiness to the wine, but also because it's man-made to some extent, there's great uniformity in how the wines age. And we made a shift to this new style of cork last year, I believe. We're very happy with the results so far. And as I mentioned, I talked to several colleagues who've been using them for years, and they've had nothing but great comments on them. So that's why we shifted to those new type of corks.
Okay. I have to say, someone noticed the backdrop that we're in, and I want you to know that we're right in the middle of the cellar, and I had to ask Dad and his assistant Ricardo to move some things just in time for the Zoom. So I love that you guys are seeing like what it's like right here, right now. one of the questions that came in beforehand and on this chat is about the fires. Have we been affected by the fires, and how does smoke impact a wine if it does?
Well, we're learning more and more about this every year, thanks to global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it. So what appears to be the case is that for the smoke to impact the character of the wine, to change it significantly, you have to have what they refer to as fresh smoke. So you need to be close to the source of the fire, and normally the smoke really needs to be blowing into your vineyard. Fortunately, the fire that was closest to us this year was about 5 or 8 miles away from us. And what smoke did get here was very high in the atmosphere and not at all fresh. So we have everything we've tasted so far, we have no indication that's impacted the quality of wine at all. We have sent a sample out to the lab, but as you might imagine, the turnaround time is quite slow this year, 2 to 4 weeks. So hopefully we'll get the results back before we pick Cabernet, but I'm not particularly worried that about the impact of smoke this year.
Great, I'm gonna scroll through some of the questions, and you're doing such a good job of talking about so many different topics. So one of the questions that came in was talking about how our wines age, both the Next Red and the Chardonnay. And, you know, Scott, maybe you could talk about how you found it and what patrons have been finding in the ageability of the Chardonnay and the Next Red.
Yeah, the question of aging is probably one of the most consistent questions that we get. And the bottom line is that, you know, as you heard and tasted with Parke and Sarah, the wine changes over time. And the most important thing is for you to enjoy the wine when it's perfect for you. So there's some people who enjoy a really young, fresh, crisp Chardonnay, and others who appreciate the fact that age confers softness to the Chardonnay. Same with the red wines, the Next Red and the Cabernet. I think that if there's sort of a house palate, I would say that when we release our Chardonnay in September, we think it's a little bit young, and probably by the beginning of the next year, just in 6 months, we find it starting to develop bottle bouquet and open up. That being said, you know, those of us that are happy to be on the other end of the phone when you call, you know, we hear stories all the time. You know, someone got the wine, they ordered a case, they thought it was great, and they call 4 weeks later and they want another case because they've already drunk the first case. And, you know, that person obviously loves it when it's young. Not too long ago, we had a patron who sent us a photograph of a 30-year-old Chardonnay of ours that they had found in their cellar. And we all kind of cringed thinking, oh my God, it's probably not drinkable. And this patron had enjoyed it and loved it. And it was showing very significant age notes and probably sweet, not necessarily to our liking, but they just happened to find it in their cellar, and it was an opportunity to try it. When people call us and they say, oh my God, no, you know, I found this old bottle of wine in my cellar, what should I do with it? The answer is always the same. You're not going to know how it is until you pull the cork. So I think all of us are, you know, a little bit needlessly scared about old wines. But the bottom line is just to drink what you like. And on the Cabernets, we release the magnums of Cabernet when they're 10 years old and the double magnums when they're 14 years old. And that's just when we're making them available for the first time. So we obviously think that the cabs in particular age very, very well, well into 20, 25 years or longer.
Okay. One of the questions in here was about decanting wine, and maybe Dad, you can give a little brief talk about it, but I'll follow up with everyone, and I'll send a link. Dad wrote a nice blog about when and why to decant wine, so you can dive a little bit deeper, but just top level, if you don't mind.
I think a lot of people have the wrong impression about decanting, that it's for older wines. Yeah, if the older wine's really stinky and you want to maybe blow off some of those aromas, then it might be justified. But usually winemakers use it to get a little bit of air in the wine in young wines to allow them to develop quickly, because they're going to enjoy the wine with dinner. And so generally speaking, we use decanting only in young wines, or if they're, as I said, stinky or maybe spritzy, you might want to decant it, but generally it's young wines.
Okay. So one question was, what's the optimum temperature to serve a Chardonnay? Maybe you both have an opinion of which.
Go ahead. Everybody has their own opinion about
Yeah,
this.
yeah. What's the numerical number? 60.
I don't know.
Okay.
We throw it in the fridge.
Yeah. So
Place it in the fridge.
we put our Chardonnay in the refrigerator so that it's nice and cool. And some other people pull it out of their cellar. It's really an issue of personal taste. Sarah will often tell the story that, you know, Dad likes his Chardonnay a lot cooler, and when they're having a glass of wine before dinner, you know, Dad wants his right out of the refrigerator, and Sarah wants hers not as cool. The one thing that does happen is that when the wine is cooler, the wine is more close as it's not that it's warming up, but as the temperature rises, it's going to be more accessible. And in fact, Kate and I, who call on restaurants, a lot of times we won't take Chardonnay into a restaurant really chilled, because we want them to try it and be able to see it very plainly. If you have a flaw in a wine, if you chill the wine, you can hide it. And since there's no flaw in our wine, we want the credit for that.
Great. One of the questions that we got in by email earlier was, how has COVID affected our wine sales, and what are we hearing from patrons? So again, you can speak to that.
This has been a really interesting year for all of us, and you know, just totally unpredictable. So in March and April, when people were really hunkering down, our wine sales and a lot of peer wineries experienced a sort of surge in sales. We felt very fortunate that we've been selling wine direct to you and other patrons for decades. So we knew how to do it. People trusted us. They knew that the wine was safe. It wasn't coming off a store shelf. And, you know, it's always sort of optimum conditions because the wine leaves the winery, goes to your house. It's never really in a warehouse or anywhere for more than a week. It's pretty pristine conditions. So our sales have been really strong. We did something in April to help people restock their cellars by putting together a mixed case of Chardonnays that was very, very popular. The other thing that's been interesting, and we've noticed this throughout the pandemic, is people have written us and told us about old wines, older vintages that they've been keeping in their cellar, waiting for sort of a special moment. And I think one of the things that's happened for all of us during this time is we have chosen to seize those special moments and not wait for a Saturday night, but to enjoy them on a Thursday night. And so we have heard from so many patrons who've pulled mainly Cabernets, sometimes Magnums, sometimes Next Red, and they have, they've just been enjoying these wines that they've squirreled away, which is such a deep honor for us. It's, for me, it's the best part of my day when I hear that how much our wines mean to people. So sales are up, people are choosing special things. And it's also, you know, it's also sort of how does this relate to the tasting now? The 2018 Chardonnay and the 2016 Next Red, you know, who knows what the next few months are gonna hold. And this is always the best time when a wine is just released. It's always the best time to stock up because the value is the greatest. So you can tell them in sales.
Great. So sorry, let me just see. I want to make sure that I get to as many as possible. It's hard to kind of jump through all of them. And I think the last question that came in, and Scott sort of touched on it, was how do you get these wines? And if people enjoyed the library vintages, or you're on the Zoom and you didn't have a chance to order them, can you order them, and how do we do that? And I think that will wrap up the Q&A, and I'll run upstairs and get a poll ready. So put in your descriptors of the wines into the chat or into the Q&A, and be thinking about which your favorite is.
So if you didn't have an opportunity to order these wines earlier, I suspect everybody had the 2018 Chardonnay and the 2016 Next Red because it's part of the annual tasting program. But if you didn't have an opportunity to order the two previous vintages to the Next Red or the main Chardonnay, you can either just shoot us an email or go to the shopping cart. People also write us frequently and they say, oh, I've got all the vintages of Cabernet from 1995 to the current release, but I'm missing two vintages. If we have those wines available, we're happy to sell them to you. They're not going to be on the website. They're not going to be sort of on the list of what's available. But people often reach out to us because they want to fill in a particular vintage that they have. The other thing that people do, a lot of times they want to memorialize a certain year. It could be the year that a child was born, or the year that a grandchild was born, or the year of a wedding. And so, you know, people will call us and say, can I get, is there any chance you have any 2005 Cabernet? And again, we're just honored that people ask that, and if we have it in inventory, we're happy to make it available. So this was what I was referring to earlier when I went rogue and went off script. We are interested in what is the favorite wine that you tasted today, and which doesn't necessarily mean it's your favorite wine of all times, but it's right now of the wines that you tasted. We'd be curious to hear what you think. So please take the poll, and we'll share the results in a few minutes. And did you guys end up talking about the wines that you were, the grapes that you harvested today?
Oh, we mentioned that we picked Thibodeau,
Yeah, I just, people are always asking how the harvest is going, how it looks.
Yeah, quick update. So this year, yields were down across, you know, for most everybody who I've talked to, which is great because misery loves company. But all joking aside, actually, it's a good thing that yields are down. The market's been a little soft, and so we sell grapes. We usually sell about half the grapes we grow, and this will help firm up the market for next year. So we have finished picking Chardonnay, and then I think I mentioned that 2 days ago we picked Malbec, and today we picked the Petit Verdot. All that we have left to pick now is Cabernet. We have like 35 acres of Cabernet to pick, and we are looking at maybe another 2 to 3 weeks before it's ready. It's an early year, and it's hard not to be chomping at the bit to finish, but I just have to remind myself, yeah, we're not even at the end of September yet. Last year we finished picking Cabernet in November, which was the latest we'd ever picked Cabernet, but usually we end up picking to the end of October. So we're still 4 weeks ahead of that time, and I suspect by the end of October we'll be wrapped up on harvest and thinking about next year, and hopefully maybe we won't have a wildfire to contend with or other fun things. Who knows? How about rosé? Yeah, so the rosé program, we did some Malbec last week for it that went straight from the vineyard as grapes into the press. So half of it is pressed immediately. The other half, as I mentioned, we bleed juice from the Malbec, what will be the Malbec red wine, and that we did 2 days ago. So the rosé in 2 stainless steel tanks, soon to be blended into one, and ticking away, fermenting. Actually, the tank I was leaning against was smelling really wonderfully because that's where part of the rosé is fermenting. I'll let Scott share the poll results with you here,
which I think you see on your screen. Great. Well, clearly the 2016 Next Red looks like was the favorite, but lots of, and fairly even on the various Next Reds, 2015, 2016, and the 2014. And interestingly, on the Chardonnay, it's the 2 outlying vintages, the 2018 Chardonnay and the 2016. 2016 being enjoying greater favorability, probably because it's open and developed and drinking wonderfully, plus the suggestive tasting that Sarah and Parke did, and the 2016 being Sarah's favorite. This has been really wonderful to be with you and to have this opportunity to taste these wines with you. Frankly, any opportunity to be with our patrons is a treat. As we approached this tasting today, those of us here thought we'd better do our homework. So a little bit earlier this week, we tasted all 6 wines outdoors in the Grove where you've been if you've joined us for a barrel tasting. And then thought, well, we better be in the hot seat, just like we've put you in the hot seat, and ask people what their favorites were. So in closing, we just want to share with you what our thoughts were about these 6 vintages. Again, thank you for being here, and we hope this is the beginning of an enjoyable weekend for you. So my favorite's definitely the 2014 Next Red. I pick up briars, mints. I love the cassis, and I just like the softness that a few more years confers.
My favorite wine was the 2018 Chardonnay. It's very fruity and it's nice on a beautiful summer day.
14 Next Red is my favorite wine because it has a lot of fruit in it, and it's starting to develop soft tannins, and it's my favorite wine. Good aromas. Cheers.
So my favorite vintage is the 2018 because my granddaughter Marie was born there. But in terms of the wine, I am loving the 2016 because of the lovely development that it has. It's really flinty. There's still some citrus notes, but it's just lovely right now. And it's what I've been drinking with Parke at home. So cheers.
I prefer the 14 Next Red, mostly because today is the fall equinox. Happy fall.
So I like the 2016 more towards the end of the night. I preferred cooking. It's really smooth. I like that minerally finish. But if I was going to start my day, I would go with the 18. I really like the fruitiness. I could just sit outside with my dog, have a glass of wine, and I would prefer the fruitiness. But like I said, I like the 16 more towards the end of the night. It's just smoother, really good with all sorts of foods. So, cheers.
So it's so hard to decide which one is my favorite, but I decided that it's the 2016 Next Red because that's the one that I have the least amount of wine left in the glass. So it must be my favorite. Cheers.
My favorite wine is the 2017 Chardonnay. I really like its citrusy aroma, and it's a really great wine with food. Cheers.
My favorite wine today was the 2016 Next Red. I thought the fruit richness really came through today. Absolutely beautiful bouquet, and should age well into the future.
Oh, it's such a hard decision. All 6 of these wines are exceptional. I love them all. But since I have to choose one, I'll say the 2016 Maine Chardonnay because it shows how well our wines age. And this is the kind of development I like in our Chardonnay, 4 to 5 years old, nice and flinty. So that's my choice. Cheers.